Hello everyone, welcome to HIM 216. We're continuing in our study of the ICD-10 CM format and conventions. In your textbook, we're on page 48. In the textbook, we will find, in ICD-10, we'll find some abbreviations used, NEC and NOS. We find them in the alphabetical index, and then we also find them in the tabular. Remember that the alphabetical index is on the left of your screen, and the tabular is on the right-hand side of the screen. Now, NEC in the alphabetical index, which I will call the index, is basically for other specified. When a specific code isn't available for a condition, the index directs the coder to an other specified code in the tabular. And then NOS, not otherwise specified, and this is equivalent to unspecified. So to put this another way, NEC means that we have a very specific diagnostic statement, but there is actually not a specific code. And NOS means that our diagnostic statement is not specific. For instance, let's look up pneumonia. When we look up pneumonia, I'll point out to you that all these terms in parenthesis are non-essential modifiers. So if my diagnostic statement is acute pneumonia or double pneumonia or migratory pneumonia, the code is J18.9, which is the default code. These terms do not affect the assignment of the code. Okay, so I'm going to click on J18.9 and I'm going to go to that code in the tabular, and you can see I'm all the way down here at the bottom highlighted, and that code is pneumonia unspecified organism. So this is a code for which we don't have any more specificity than just the term pneumonia. So let's look up something that maybe has NEC. And I'm going to look up an infection code and Actinobacillus A28.8. So let me look up that. So Actinobacillus is a very specific diagnostic statement, but there isn't a code specifically that says Actinobacillus. So it sends me to a code that has a .8, and this is other specified bacterial disease, not elsewhere classified. That is basically NEC. It doesn't say comma NEC, but it says comma not elsewhere classified. So typically when you see .9s, these are unspecified or NOS codes, and .8s are not elsewhere specified, meaning you have a specific diagnostic statement, but there isn't a specific code. If we see these terms in the tabular, NEC is still not elsewhere classifiable, and it's other specified when a specific code is not available. Basically the same thing as in the alphabetic index, and then NOS is the same thing as well. It's the equivalent of unspecified. Now let's look at punctuation. So let's look at so in the index, the classification system uses brackets. And you can see those brackets right here around F02.80. You can see F02.81. And in the tabular, these brackets include alternative wording or explanatory phrases. In the index, these are etiology manifestations. And they have to be, we'll talk about etiology manifestations in a bit, but these codes must be sequenced exactly as you see them here. So if we have a patient who has dementia, with Lewy bodies, the codes are G31.83 and F02.80, and we sequence them exactly like this. Now, we do not put brackets around our codes. We write G31.83, comma, space, F02.80. So when you see the brackets in the index, it doesn't mean that when you write that code, you put the brackets around the code. It's telling you specifically that this is an example, or that this code is an etiology with a manifestation, and you have to sequence them exactly as you see them here. If you have any questions about that, please do ask questions. If you have any questions, let me know. Now, parentheses are used in both the alphabetical index and in the tabular, and they include supplementary words, they include the non-essential modifiers. And so, for instance, you can see that if we look at and I'll just show you this while we're here. This is an example of wraparound text. Do you see how this is indented 5 spaces? That's wraparound text. Do you see how this is indented 2 spaces? That's a more specific, that's a subterm. It's a more specific term. This is, I'm probably getting ahead of myself here. The term delivery, the bolded black term, is a main term. Childbirth is a non-essential modifier. Labor is a non-essential modifier. Arrested activity phase, this is indented 2 spaces. It's a subterm. Cesarean is indented 2 spaces. It's a subterm. 4 is a non-essential modifier. And then abnormal is indented 2 spaces. It's a more specific subterm. Pelvis is indented 2 spaces. It's a more specific subterm. And then it has all these non-essential modifiers. So that's how these, how the alphabetical index is formatted. If we have codes that are titled Other or Other Specified, these are used when there's information in the medical record that provides detail and there is not a specific code for that. Again, this goes back to the term NEC, and NOS is other or unspecified code. Then we have includes notes and we have inclusion terms. And includes notes appear under a 3-character code, so that means they are in the tabular. So I'm going to choose that has an excludes note. Okay, so when we're looking at acute sinusitis, we can see that this category, and this is a category, that this category includes an acute abscess of the sinus, empyema, infection, inflammation, separation. So that's what an includes note tells us under a category. Then there are inclusion terms. And this is a list of terms that's included under some codes, and this also applies to this category as well. So we're in category J09, and under this subcategory of J09.X, we have avian influenza, bird influenza. So these are terms that are included with this subcategory of influenza due to identified novel influenza A virus. So this is an example of just what an inclusion term looks like. Then we have excludes notes. Now with excludes notes, there are two types of excludes notes. Each of them has a different definition, but they're similar in that they indicate codes that are excluded from each other and are independent of each other. We're talking about an excludes 1 and an excludes 2. Now I want to go back to the coding guidelines, because we had, you remember when we were looking through the coding guidelines, we identified that exclude 1 had updated information. So this is in addition to what's in your textbook. When we have an excludes 1 note, it means not coded here. So if your diagnosis code is included as an excludes 1, it means that that code and the code you're coding should not be coded together, and I'll show you examples of this. It's used when two conditions cannot be coded together, such as a congenital form versus an acquired form of the same condition. So it can either be genital or congenital or acquired, but it can't be both. But there is an exception to the excludes 1 definition, and I'm going to tell you right now that there are many exceptions to rules in coding. And this exception is when the definition is when the circumstance when there are two conditions that are unrelated to each other. And if it's not clear whether the conditions are related or not, then you need to query the provider. And the example they have here is F45.8, and we'll look at that in just a minute. Other somatoform disorder has an excludes note 1 for sleep-related teeth grinding, which is G47.63, because teeth grinding is an inclusion term under F45.8. So only one of those two codes should be assigned for teeth grinding. However, psychogenic dysmenorrhea is also an inclusion term under F45.8, and a patient could have both that condition and sleep-related teeth grinding. So in this case, the two conditions are clearly unrelated to each other. So you could assign the code F45.8 and G47.3. Okay, so let's go take a look at this. So in the tabular, I'm going to search on this term F45.8. And I can see that that is other somatoform disorder. And you can see that there is an excludes note 1, sleep-related teeth grinding, G47.63. So if I click on that code and go to this, it basically tells me that this is sleep-related teeth grinding. It's the same code. However, the example in our excludes note was that psychogenic dysmenorrhea is an inclusion term under F45.8. Did you see that? It was the very first subterm that we looked at. Psychogenic dysmenorrhea. And a patient could have psychogenic dysmenorrhea and sleep-related teeth grinding, and they're not related to each other, so you could assign both of those codes. So when we go back to this, other somatoform disorders, this includes psychogenic dysmenorrhea. Okay, so if we look at teeth grinding, it can either be psychogenic F45.8, which is the code that we're looking at here, or it could be sleep-related G47.63. Sleep-related. So when we look at F45.8, this term is for other somatoform disorders. It includes psychogenic dysmenorrhea and these other conditions that are listed here. Teeth grinding is one of them. So if our patient has psychogenic dysmenorrhea, we must assign this code F45.8. But if our patient also has sleep-related teeth grinding, which is not related to psychogenic dysmenorrhea, we also need to be able to assign this code G47.63. And that's what this guideline is telling you, is when you look at a code, and it includes conditions like this other somatoform disorder. This is not a specific code. It includes many things. It has an excludes note 1 for sleep-related teeth grinding, which is not related to all of the terms that are listed for this code. So even though we have an excludes note 1, we can still go ahead and assign that code if it is unrelated to the term that is grouping under that code. And if I go to dysmenorrhea and then psychogenic, it takes me to F45.8. And I know that is confusing. We'll look at other examples of that, but I wanted to explain it to you while we are at this coding guideline. Now, we will also see excludes note 2 throughout ICD-10. And those are excludes notes 1. Okay, here's an exclude note 2. And an exclude note 2 is basically telling us that if our patient has this condition, acanthamoebiasis, that's a mouthful, then we need to add that code because it is not included in this term for amoebiasis. So let's find another example of an excludes 2. Let me pick another chapter. Okay, this is an exclude notes 2 that applies to this entire chapter. This is chapter 10. And we can see that conditions that are originate in the perinatal period, if our patient has a condition that codes to chapter 10 that originated in the perinatal period, we also need to add a code from chapter 16, and these P codes are from chapter 16. If we have a patient that has a condition that codes to a disease that codes to chapter 10, they may also have an infectious or parasitic disease that codes to the categories of A00 through B99, and I'm going to show you an example of that. If we have influenza and pneumonia, we may have a bacterial pneumonia, and you can see that there are organisms associated with these bacterial pneumonias. But if we have an organism and there is not a specific code for it, a combination code for it, then we would have a code from chapter 1. Okay, so we are going to, and I'll show you another, probably an example. If a patient has a urinary tract infection, that codes to M39.0. And you can see that we have an instructional note. Use additional code B95 to B97 to identify the infectious agent. We do have an excludes note 1 associated with this code. But let's say that my urinary tract infection is due to E. coli, and I have a code, E. coli as a cause of disease classified elsewhere, B96.20. So that is an example of a condition that needs an additional code to specify the organism. Now, etiology manifestation convention, this is on the bottom of page 49. And I'm going to go ahead and conclude the lecture here. And for your question for this lecture, I want you to tell me the difference in NEC and NOS. So when we are looking at NEC, how is that different than when we're looking at NOS? And that will conclude this lecture.